we have a lot of companies still not disclosing and measuring and, start early on the journey. So any thoughts or advice for companies looking to start out in terms of their emissions reporting and disclosure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really great question. I think the classic things that we'd often encourage companies to think about when they're starting their disclosure is really to focus on scope 1 and 2 emissions and to report that in an accurate way. Ideally, over time, to get those emissions verified as well, in order to ensure the sort of quality and integrity of the data that's being disclosed and also shared with customers. So scope 1 and 2, from a kind of initial disclosure point of view, I think is very important for the supply chain members that we're working with, and is often a very kind of focus for them. Alongside that, we see a lot of the supply chain members, again, that we work with, focusing on the targets that their suppliers are setting. So as a company, again, that's getting started on this process, setting a goal in terms of your emission reduction ambitions that you can communicate to customers, again, is also a very kind of powerful indication of your ambition as a company, essentially. And then the third component I'd also emphasize is to implement some kind of emission reduction initiative, whether that is the switch to renewable energy, perhaps some occupancy sensors, switching to LED lighting, some simple things to get started with in terms of reducing your energy use. And then again, disclosing that through CDP. So those three things, the reporting of scope 1 and 2, setting a target, and then communicating some kind of initiatives that are helping to get towards those targets.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I know a lot of people are somewhat nervous or afraid about the whole process, and they want to have everything perfect. I love Grainne's quote about not letting perfection be the enemy of progress, in terms of really the value is starting out. So whether it's starting to measure your emissions or starting to report them, get on the journey, get working on it. I have a question for Grainne on that, because like we get the purists telling us, oh, you need to focus on the material issues. So there's no point in ignoring, focusing on items that are not that critical, maybe employee commute or something like that, which isn't the big factor. You should be focusing on the big things. But very often we see companies starting and getting comfortable. I mean, what's your thought on that, Grainne? Should we just get comfortable with some stuff that we might have data on, or should we be trying to hit the big stuff? Or what do you see by way of a journey for companies?
I would say to start off with what you're comfortable with, but if you know something is a big emission source for you, but it's very difficult for you to tackle at the start. To maybe have a plan in the future to start to tackle that. Maybe you don't have it in your first year, you're just getting yourself comfortable with maybe say wastewater or something like that. But you can build yourself towards it in the future, even if the first time you calculate it, it's very secondary data. It's really just a ballpark figure. It's not really something you're comfortable disclosing outwardly, just so you have an understanding the magnitude of that emission source and how material it might be for you. And then you can improve that as you go along.
Perfect. Okay, really, really good. And we do see that. We see publicly a lot of companies making that commitment to address operational emissions initially, and then to, over time, it's absolutely valid to start addressing additional issues, items of scope 3 emissions. So now I'd like to invite our two other panelists to join us, and that's Ken O'Farrell from Microsoft and David Fitzgerald from Kellogg. And I think we can see Ken on screen there. Hopefully you can hear us okay, Ken. I'm going to ask the rest of you, please, for the moment, if you can, to stay on mute while we get the perspectives of Ken and David. If you have questions, Shay will be collecting them in the chat box. So please fire ahead, post your questions in there. We'll do our best to pick them up and to ask them to you. So we have, I guess we'll start with you, Ken, maybe just to give us a quick insight. So Microsoft, phenomenal ambition that you've announced, and I spoke about the competition. What's this getting all of these organizations competing with each other as to who's going to be the most sustainable and reduce the carbons. And I guess that sort of moonshot announcement that we saw from you some months back, I'd love to hear about about that and you know, how the ambition is filtering down to your part of the operation, which is freight and logistics.
Sure, thanks, Brian. I think absolutely Microsoft came up with this big, bold initiative. I think we were spinning a little bit on sustainability, and then Satya Nadella came back, who's our CEO, and basically there are two bold initiatives. One, by 2030, that we would be carbon negative, and that's scope 1, 2, and 3, and 2, by 2050. We would reverse any carbon emissions since we started the company in 1975. So if you think of those, they're quite. The first one is quite an aggressive target, and the second one then is like really just, you know, we'd have had no impact ever since we came in. So they're quite bold initiatives, and it comes from I suppose the culture of the org under Satya has changed dramatically over the last number of years, and really it's about innovation, collaboration, growth mindset, diversity, inclusiveness. How do you bring all that to the table? And then he applied those principles again into, well, how do we set a leading edge sustainability? We don't want to look at anybody, we don't want to copy anybody, we just want to do the right thing and see how you could do that. So I think by creating such a bold corporate vision, what it's done for us, it's liberated the thinking a bit in Microsoft internally. So now all the business groups who manage all the products like Surface or Xbox or some of the other business like Azure, that concentrates the mind. On top of that, we have internal charges, so we charge $15 per CO2 ton admitted by each of the businesses. So it focuses the mind, but really, what I think the idea of the bold initiative, it liberates and it allows you to be, you have to be more innovative. You have to get your house in order to tackle something like that. If you don't, you really just, you're just not, you're never going to hit that target. And that's really what it does. Instead of feeling huge pressure, it's actually quite liberating.
Interesting. So and how does it trickle down to you, Ken, in terms of, you got the vision strategically, in terms of your involvement, you're dealing with suppliers. What kind of things are you doing practically?
So I think what it does is it does a couple of things. So shoots about a shot across the bow of all our suppliers that this is something that's been taken seriously, and it's something that Microsoft has signed up. So straight away, your supplier and your base know that this question is coming, and then they're going to try and step up to the bar as well. But for us, if I just take the fulfillment and logistics network, so if you think about it, we have a lot of manufacturing in Southeast Asia. It comes into the various distribution centers we have around the world, and then they're fulfilled to various channels like B2C, enterprise, retail, disty, the traditional channels. And then what we've been doing is that we've what we call a cloud-based supply chain, so based off Azure. And what we've done is we have implemented a TMS, a transport management system. So it calculates distance, it calculates all our movements, it tells us what mode is traveled by, oceans, air, truck, whatever it is, and how it gets to the channel. And what we've been doing is we've overlaid the GLEC measurement, so the Global Logistics Emissions Council. So that framework and those calculations, we got GLEC to validate it. And basically, we have built a CO2 emissions tool effectively. So it allows us to calculate. So the first and important thing is, before we could have a conversation with anybody, you have to be able to say, here's where I'm at. And that's been the fundamental difference. So now we can say where we're at. Now we can, and it kind of talks a little bit what Hugo talked about there. Once you know where you are and you know what your target is, then you can start setting out some policy changes internally in Microsoft, whether we go by sea rather than by air, some business framework changes that we've had to do. And then you sit down with your suppliers, and you know what we're seeing in our quarterly business reviews with all our major carriers. They're having to come in and articulate their sustainability mission. They're getting involved. We're having collaborative type sustainability projects where we're bringing them in and they're sitting with other carriers and we're saying, this is what we want, what are you doing? And it just engenders more and more participation, and and then you start getting a few successes on the back of that, and then it starts lifting from there. So we're very clear in what we're doing, and we're very clear in our measurements and where we're going, and then we start stitching all the projects together to enable that to happen.
I'd like to come back to you on that after, about that incentivize the suppliers versus, let's say, gentle encouragement. But before you do, I'd like to bring Dave Fitzgerald in. So Dave from Kellogg, obviously, Dave, you're very visible. You're on our breakfast table every morning. You know, as an organization, we can see there must be vast amounts of activity in the supply chain, and from farming right through. So what does this mean to Kellogg, first of all, in terms of strategically, what kind of ambition is there? You know, how are you, and how are you focusing on your Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, it's really interesting just listening to Hugo and to Ken, and there's a lot of parallels, I think, in terms of, you know, how we're approaching it. So we in Kellogg, we have a science-based target. We agreed back in 2015. So within that, we're obviously focusing on Scope 1 and 2, but we have a Scope 3 target as well. And I suppose the first thing you need to do, as Ken says, is you need to measure. You need to know where your emissions are, because if you want to develop a strategy, you need to know where you're going to focus your resources to get the biggest impact. And I suppose as part of that journey, we've been working with CDP and CDP Supply Chain to gather that information and engage our suppliers. So we've been involved in that for about the last 3 years now with CDP. Last year, I think we engaged about 400 suppliers through CDP Supply Chain globally. This year, we've reduced the number a little bit because we've become a little bit more focused and a little bit more purposeful about, you know, which suppliers we would include in that journey. And it has been a challenge, you know, getting suppliers on board. It's quite daunting in terms of, you know, making a submission to CDP. A lot of suppliers in our supply chain would be, you know, from an agricultural base. They wouldn't have a lot of resources dedicated to sustainability, measuring carbon emissions. Some of them, you know, haven't really thought about it in the past. So even just getting them on board, getting them thinking about it, has taken quite a lot of time and effort. So the way we do it now is we focus it based on a spend threshold. So we look at our top 80% of our spend, and we have a large tail of smaller spend suppliers that we don't necessarily involve in this process unless they're in a sector which has a risk of, you know, higher carbon emissions relative to others. And we exclude some segments, some categories within our procurement in terms of, you know, sectors that we know won't have a big impact on our supply chain. So overall, we're still in the process, I would say, of gathering that information and data. We know that it was interesting looking at the ratio as well that Hugo put up. Our Scope 3 to Scope 1 is about 6 to 1, which is pretty much exactly where you know, the food and beverage sector would be. So we have a big job to do, and a big chunk of that is agricultural emissions, and there are no easy solutions for agricultural emissions, and so we got to work with that sector in particular. And within that sector, you know, as a plant-based company with rice suppliers, rice is one of the bigger offenders when it comes to carbon emissions within the agricultural side of things. So, you know, again, it's about knowing where the emissions are and then basing your strategy on, you know, and where you focus your resources to reduce your emissions.
And can I ask you about that data side? Obviously, you're using data from CDP, are you collecting data from suppliers? You have a much more diversified, broad supply chain, I guess. How are you managing that data challenge?
Yeah, it's still a challenge in certain ways. Our focus initially has been on tier 1 suppliers, engaging them. As I said, some of them in the logistics sector would be a good example where they are a little bit further down the line in terms of how they measure their emissions. There's some legislation and guidelines in Europe for logistics companies around reporting and recording of emissions. So they tend to be a little bit more, let's say, developed in this area. If you look at some of the agricultural suppliers, the data quality is not so good, you know. So, you know, you're talking about, as I said, emissions from rice growing, from the processing of rice. The processors will have their own Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but they probably won't have that upstream agricultural data. So we're working with organizations, for example, like the Cool Farm Alliance, who have a tool called the Cool Farm tool. So we use that tool with our suppliers to estimate emissions in our supply chain at the farm level. You know, we're investing in a little bit of academic research around developing those tools as well to give us better quality data, because at the moment it's probably based on quite generic emission factors, sometimes based on spend even rather than commodity. Commodity-based emission factors. So it's you know, the quality can vary depending on the particular category you're looking at, and we're working to improve that as time goes on.
Yeah, and I think Grainne spoke to that in her presentation about, you know, there isn't a one fits all. This is not going to be all one pipe that collects all the data. You will always have some element of other type of extrapolation or average. Yeah, just I'm fascinated, and maybe I'll start with Hugo on this one around the carrot or stick, particularly in this space, because we're dealing with suppliers. There's commercial issues here. So, you know, are we favoring, and I believe at one of our supply chain events, we had one of the supply chain teams say that they'd set a bar that all their suppliers had to be all their key suppliers had to be a B- or better on their CDP supply chain. And I've seen that in a number of sustainability reports recently, where companies are actually specifying that kind of, that stick that they're putting out there, get up there and hit that target, or you're going to be taken off the list, versus they bring them all along and teach them and help. And so where does CDP would see a lot of this, Hugo? What sort of activity, where do you lie on the carrot or stick?
Yeah, really interesting question, and I think you see sort of different strategies in terms of the companies that we work with. But generally, I think the important thing to emphasize is this is a kind of shared responsibility. I think more companies are starting to look at the engagement with supply chains and even consumers as well as being a kind of a shared responsibility. So the kind of the carrot, I guess, when you're looking at it from a supply chain point of view, is that the suppliers that operate in a more sustainable way may find themselves in a more favorable position when it comes to actually deepening their relationship with the companies that they're working with, that are interested in their sustainability performance. And so, as you say, we see the CDP score or certain KPIs increasingly integrated into kind of procurement scorecards, for example, and looked at during annual meetings with suppliers to kind of assess their environmental performance alongside a load of other critical kind of procurement KPIs. And I think you can look at that as carrot or stick. It's either, you know, but by performing well, there's that incentive that you'll potentially get more business from that organization. By performing less strongly on environmental aspects, potentially that could compromise your ability to work with that organization. But generally, I think it's important for companies to look to ways in which they can help to support the suppliers in their journey towards environmental leadership. You know, we see some great examples there of companies, including those on the panel today, that leverage their own internal expertise to help their suppliers improve their performance, identify ways that they can reduce their energy use, for example. And I think that's great, because it kind of deepens the relationship between those companies and their suppliers as well.
Very interesting. And I've got to ask Ken, because I've been fascinated watching the big bad Microsoft turn into this, you know, fluffy leadership organization that's out there. Just, I don't know whether that's Satya or whatever that's driving that, but are you doing that with your suppliers? Are you putting your arms around everyone, and or are you still kicking them a little?
No, I think you have to set a standard. So there's no mistaking that, right? And then you have a choice if you want to be a strategic partner with Microsoft, and there's benefits that come with that. Then I think you open up that, and you kind of get them to buy into the Microsoft philosophy. So it's not just like sustainability; is that we're looking at a lot of our supplier base to be working with us in terms of sharing our cultural values, and then in there, then obviously sustainability is a huge part of what we're trying to do. So you're trying to set a bar, and then saying, okay, now come work with us, and we will work with you, and then you're going to get, like, I like Hugo made a point there. It is a shared responsibility, and the reason it's a shared responsibility is it affects everybody. So everybody from the end consumer to the enterprise customer to the retailer, like ultimately the customer is going to demand this, is going to drive this. So, you know, if you're disconnected from your customer base and customer wants, like you're not going to be leading anything for a long time, whether you're a Microsoft or whether you're one of our suppliers. So there's a collective will to do this because it's the right thing to do, and it's what your customer base are demanding going forward, you know. So
Yeah.
you know, so strategically, if you work with your supplier, you'll get further. So I'll give you an example, Brian. So we have our largest distribution center is in Europe, so we ship everything out from there. And like 12 months ago, we sat down with our partner Arvado to try and figure out how how do we tackle this differently, and then how would you do it in a carbon neutral way. So what we've worked with them over the last 12 months is, and this is the beauty of working together, because then you get innovated. So we've worked with SunPower, who are the solar power company. We've worked with the landlord who owns the building. It's a 450,000 square foot facility. We've worked with Arvado and ourselves. And now what we're doing is we've created a model where we're getting some funding from the Dutch government. The SunPower are making an ROIC, and both Arvado and ourselves are getting the whole place retrofitted out, and it's not costing anybody anything. And that's the collective will of doing it. And what we're going to get by December of this year, we'll have a carbon neutral distribution center. So it's never happened before for us. So it's a big deal for us. But if you work collectively, every party wins. You know,
well, that is a super case study. I love the collaboration, the innovation, the cost benefit. There's lots of win-wins there. Dave, Kellogg's, your approach to suppliers, I mean, you must have some that are not doing anything and that need a push, or how are you engaging that carrot or stick policy?
Yeah, it's, I mean, sorry, I turned on mute there for a second. A little bit like Ken said, it's, you're setting a standard, you're setting an expectation, and you're being set a standard as well. I mean, Kellogg as a business, we're being challenged by our customers, the retailers, and they're being challenged by consumers to do more about this stuff. So ultimately, as Ken said, it's coming all the way through the value chain. So, a standard is being set, we're talking about science-based targets, net zero, these are the buzzwords that are out there, everyone's hearing them. Businesses are setting the standard and saying, this is what we want to achieve. Now let's work with our suppliers. So there is a piece around getting them on board, and sometimes it does take some persuasion. Where you have strategic partnerships with suppliers, that's one thing, and it's included in your SRM, your supplier relationship management processes, and your strategic meetings with suppliers. But then for those smaller suppliers, it can be challenging, and what you're trying to do there is facilitate them to get them on board. So for example, one of the approaches we take with CDP Supply Chain is we say, for year one, we want you to get in, have a look at the questionnaire, and here are some priority questions that Kellogg would like you to answer, rather than the full questionnaire, because it's a huge task and very daunting for a small supplier coming in at the start. So we try and work with them on that, and then as we evolve through the process, help them to improve the quality of their data, and that's where we are now. We're looking for better quality data. So it's a little bit of both, Brian. I mean, but ultimately you will have to work with these suppliers. If it's a stick, I don't think we're going to get them on board. And you're relying a little bit on policymakers and regulators as well to set a sort of a floor, to set a level to which everyone must come, and in that way maybe get some of these businesses on board with this as well over time, because ultimately, the standards in Europe are raising. You've seen now Europe raising its ambition potentially to 55% carbon reduction by 2030. So that will, filter down again through the businesses, and in terms of the regulations as well, and I think bring more businesses into scope. So there's a place for policymakers in this discussion as well, I think.
Yeah, obviously, we're not. It's interesting. We're seeing regulation almost catching up, whereas it seems to be that corporate ambition is what's driving a lot of the change at the moment. And I guess that could be a theme for a whole other webinar. Shay, I'm just going to check if there's any questions that are coming in there that you want to pass over to the panel.
Yeah, we have a question in from Jamie Corcoran, and he's just wondering about reporting of emissions for our 100% renewable electricity producer.
So reporting emissions for a 100% renewable
electricity producer.
So I guess that's a scope 2 issue really in that context, right? Or are you talking about the producer themselves reporting their emissions, I wonder? It was a point that Dave, you brought up. There's a lot of focus about renewable energy, and that's critical. And I think your project, Dave, spoke to renewable energy in your supply chain. The other issue you mentioned earlier today was renewable fuels. There's a significant part of that. So again, I don't know if you've any thoughts around how do we encourage that kind of activity for companies to drive renewable fuels, because I guess as well as energy, the scope 1 issues have to be addressed.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to, Brian, I know we were talking about earlier about the circular approach, and you know, there has been very much a focus on renewable electricity, and you know, there are organizations for whom their scope 2 emissions are a very significant part, but there are also organizations for whom scope 1 emissions are, you know, particularly in the food and beverage sector. I've worked in brewing, I've worked in dairy, now working in cereals, where heat demand is a massive challenge for those sectors, you know. So renewable heat, you know, where 75% of your energy usage is heat based, is based on fuels, gases, or you know, natural gas or other things. So, and I think this is an area, particularly within the supply chain, where you can look at some circular approaches around, you know, renewable fuels like biogas, for example, being generated from food waste or from agricultural byproducts and things like that, that will hopefully resolve some of those issues. So I think that whole renewable space, there's a bit to go on that yet. I think the electricity bit is well advanced and has become quite mature, but I think on the heat side, there still is a way to go on that for businesses.
And obviously encouraging your suppliers to move to more renewable solutions drives down your scope 3 emissions in your supply chain. And something I think that Grainne touched on was obviously within that journey then, those product emissions in the circular economy. Like we saw, what was it, 50-60% of a lot of the case studies you showed. I think actually it was the Microsoft Surface, where the physical materials and the manufacturing were 75%. So I guess the role of the circular economy in keeping that carbon locked in, particularly in our supply chains. I don't know, any comment, is there anything, Ken, in terms of circular stuff, in terms of carbon that you guys are doing from a circular economy perspective?
Well, I think so. Like I said, we measure everything. So, but I think we've had you know, I suppose it is that circle, right? So product design is a huge part, and a through a sustainability lens, that's really grown. So like, you know, if we look at some of our new products coming through, like Surface, you know, is it repairable within the market? That's a new thing that we're driving, so that, you know, you don't throw everything out. It's reusable, it's recyclable, it's modular, so that it can be plugged in and out with the next phase or next launch products. Those type of activities are key in that whole circular discussion. Then you get into manufacturing, then you get into making sure that your procurement policies are correct. They're all linked in as well. You're getting to packaging distribution, which we talked about. Then you're talking about customer usage. So, you know, are we providing the next generation of products that look at customer usage? So if I take again that Surface example, our Surface Pro X, which is our newest Surface Pro X, is 28% more efficient in terms of battery life than the previous version. So you're looking at that as well, and then you kind of get into the end of life disposal and how you're managing that. And again, we map and track that very carefully as well. But you're doing it all. But certainly at the very start, your product design is key, because that kind of sets you up for success in one shape or fashion as well.
And I love your carbon calculator to help companies to measure the impact of using Microsoft Cloud services as well. It's very interesting. Shay, I'm not sure we answered that.
Yeah, we have just a couple of other questions.
Sure, right.
James Atkinson is just asking, will there be any other discussions from either Clearstream or CDP on the Global Logistics Emissions Council?
Yeah, it's a good question, because as we've got into the detail, and I think Ken acknowledged the work that GLEC is doing, there are a number of leading frameworks in that space to help companies address transportation emissions. And it's a complex system. We've air travel, sea travel, there's a lot of assets, there's a lot of investment that's already out there that's not carbon friendly. So yes, I think it's a question for us to look at the logistics section maybe as a specific item, a big issue. I think it appeared at about 10% on average from numbers we've seen. I think, Ken, in your analysis, the logistics and supply chain was a little under 10, but depending on the sector, it tends to account for that of a physical supply chain. So definitely worth the conversation. And if you have any thoughts on it, James, let us know. Shay, any other question? I'm not sure we answered Jamie's question particularly well, but we can come back to it.
Absolutely. Just a question in from Brian Gray. He's just maybe for Hugo. He's wondering what the entry-level offering from CDP on the supply chain program is.
The entry-level offering in terms of membership? Yeah, absolutely. So our kind of entry-level sort of package is, we call it corporate supply chain membership. And that would enable the member to request up to 500 of their key suppliers to disclose their environmental data through CDP. And our kind of if we want to talk kind of pricing, I'm happy to share some further details now or perhaps after the call. But essentially, the package would enable the member to request that information from those suppliers, and then we provide a kind of engagement package that sits around that, where we would hold webinars to get those suppliers to respond to some of the key questions within the CDP Supply Chain questionnaire. As Dave alluded to earlier, there's some kind of usually some particular aspects of the climate change questionnaire that are of a particular importance to the member, so we would hold engagement webinars to kind of emphasize those kind of aspects of the questionnaire, and bits that are kind of key to the members' supply chain strategy with regard to science-based targets, for example, as well, deforestation or water security.
So it can be. I'm not going to let Brian start. He's a great negotiator. I'm not going to let him start negotiating fees with you on the call, but we can put you in contact. But I think the interesting thing we notice is that very often companies that are now responding themselves were one time or were asked themselves at some stage by a buyer, and now they are now in turn asking their suppliers. So we're seeing that upstream, downstream, trickle down. And obviously you provide a lot of support during that process, Hugo. So I'd expect that we would see a help. We may be we may be going to go power-wise down a little, are we? I just noticed the power thing has just dipped a little. Shay, anything else coming through?
No, we've no other questions in.
I had another question for the guys in terms of what we see as a good place to start, because once again a lot of the companies are only starting out on this. So if you have a piece of advice, Ken, if you were looking to be a supplier to Microsoft, or you were starting out on your journey as a supplier reporting, what kind of things would you see critical to get yourself doing? Any advisory and thoughts?
Yeah, I think just getting your baseline data correct, or as accurate as you can. Like again, it doesn't, like if you're starting off, sometimes that won't be. Don't over-index on it being 100% right at the very start. What you're trying to do is get a sense of where you are and where you want to go, and then what tends to happen is you get as you get more suppliers on board, as they get more clinical in how to give you data and how you assess that data, it gets sharper and sharper. But just, I would say, if you're starting off very fresh and you're I'm talking about scope 3 in particular, just get a sense, just try and get a sense of where you are, because that's fundamental to everything. Because if you don't know where you are, you can't plan where you're going. So just get it in a rough order of magnitude, get it in some shape, and eventually then you'll start sharpening that up or using better technology to get more accurate information.
Okay.
That's what I would say in starting off with.
And David, your final thoughts of advice for anybody starting their journey?
Yeah, I again, very much as Ken has said, it's not about being right, perfect in terms of your data. It's about getting that understanding of where it's at, and if you're looking to reach out to suppliers to give you the Scope 3 data, it's been very clear on why you're doing it. That you see them as being, critical to what you want to do with your business and in terms of your commitments, and why there's a value in it for them as well, either in continuing to be a supplier and a trusted supplier, but there are benefits to having this information, in terms of measuring their own Scope 1 and 2 emissions, the energy efficiency benefits that potentially will accrue from that as well, and just getting on that journey in terms of explaining to your suppliers. And it takes time, and CDP do provide support, as Hugo said, in terms of webinars, and we've used those with our suppliers as well to familiarize them with the system, and get started, and look at what others are doing. The internet's a great place. I spend not a lot of time, but I spend a reasonable amount of time looking at what the best in the sector are doing. They've put a lot of this stuff on the internet. They've put their emissions profiles information up there, and so it gives you an idea of where to start and what others are doing, which is always helpful when you're trying to form a plan.
And I know Grainne spends a lot of time working through it's a bit like looking at the past papers as a student, but looking at other responses, and it's a great source, as you say, of knowledge and information, the CDP responses from other companies, and we find lots of interesting case studies there to share. So don't be afraid to go online and look up some of those. Hugo, any parting thoughts in terms of the journey for people? I guess they can contact you if they're interested in implementing the supply chain program.
Absolutely, yeah. Really happy to discuss further with anybody that would like to. But I think, I think Ken and David have really well summarised the sort of great sort of first steps. A couple of thoughts I might add is, if you're just trying to identify which suppliers you want to start to engage with from a sort of primary data point of view, often looking at where the bulk of the spend is going is a really helpful starting point. So maybe starting with 60% to 80% of spend. Is there a subset of suppliers that you can identify that way as a starting point for engagement? And then the second thing I'd really emphasize as being key is internal engagement with the procurement team, as often, as obviously the main relationship when it comes to supplier engagement is through the procurement team, and so when it comes to the perspective of encouraging suppliers to disclose their environmental data, and giving the procurement team the tools that they need also to engage suppliers directly can also be a really effective strategy.
Excellent. That's a really good point. Tiering your partners and getting the procurement team involved as early as possible. Guys, that's been fantastic. Thank